Vermont Independent Senator, Democratic presidential candidate Bernie Sanders joins me now. It's so good to see you. Thank you, Senator. Thanks for being with us today.
My pleasure.
Well, first of all, the president has been tweeting today ahead of his big announcement that next week ICE will begin the process of removing the millions of illegal aliens who have illicitly found their way into the United States. Now, our reporters have not found any new plan on the books. This sounds like the same game plan before the 2018 midterms to fire up his base. Your reaction to his tweet and to his using this rhetoric on immigration right now?
Well, I think you're right. I think this is a political statement to his base. But frankly, I think this is an outrageous statement. It is absolutely un-American, not what our country stands for. And it is, Andrea, exactly what demagogues always do. He will not talk about the health care crisis. He will not talk about income and wealth inequality. He will not talk about climate change. But he will try to divide the American people up. And he will go after minority people, in this case, undocumented people who have very little political power. That's what demagogues always do. And that's why Trump must be defeated.
You know, when we look forward towards the debates, the president, again on Twitter today, he may or may not do this. He's got the G20, he's got other things that conflict, but he's talking about live tweeting while you guys are on the debate stage. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I'm surprised that he has the time to tweet. I thought he'd be watching, some Fox TV program. Look, he could tweet all that he wants to tweet. But let me just say this. You have a president who, despite what one of his supporters mentioned a moment ago, is in fact a pathological liar. He is a racist, he's a sexist, he's a homophobe, and he is a religious bigot. This is a president who is also a phony, who told his supporters in 2016 that he would stand with the working class of this country, and of course he lied. And I suspect that tonight in his speech, he will not tell them that he tried to throw 32 million people off of health care, that his last budget called for $1.5 trillion cut over 10 years to Medicaid, massive cuts to Medicare, billions in cuts to Social Security. He told his supporters in 2016 that his tax plan would not benefit the wealthy. He lied. 83% of those benefits are going to go to the top 1% after 10 years.
At the same time, he views the stock market as the index of how good the economy is, and so do a lot of Americans. They're not looking at the internal problems, not the wage disparities, of course, the millions and millions of people affected by that. But a lot of people, his supporters, are just seeing, well, the stock market's up and business community seems to be supportive of his deregulations. How do you combat that? And
well, I'll tell you how.
Powers of incumbency, and that he's raised so much more money than any Democrat.
Andrea, in this sense, I think it's not just his supporters. This is very often what media does. Oh, the stock market is up, the economy is good. Well, here's a fact that right now, today, the average American worker is making, in real inflation accounted for dollars, despite huge increases in technology and productivity, exactly the same amount of money he or she made 45 years ago. That sound like a good economy? Today, what we're seeing is a younger generation, everything being equal, the millennials will have a lower standard of living than their parents. Today, what we're seeing is that over the last 30 years, the top 1% have seen a $21 trillion increase in their wealth. The bottom half of Americans have lost $900 billion. Massive income and wealth inequality, tens of millions of families living paycheck to paycheck. Those are the issues that I will talk about during this campaign, and I think those are the issues that the average American understands are the important issues.
I want to ask you about Iran because we're seeing increasing tensions. Now 1,000 more troops deployed. Secretary Pompeo momentarily is going to be speaking from CENTCOM. Iran is now threatening to break out of the nuclear deal for the first time after complying for 14 months, according to international inspectors, even though the president withdrew from it. So we see these hits on the tankers. They say there's intelligence. At least the Brits agree with the U.S. that this was Iranian-based or Iranian-proxied. there could be an accidental war. What do you do if you're the commander-in-chief, Bernie Sanders? You're President Sanders. What do you do right now where Iran is arguably acting aggressively, even if it's in reaction to the U.S. policymaking?
First of all, just a couple of points, Andrea. First of all, what is absolutely necessary is an objective investigation as to these incidents. The destruction or the bombing or the attacking of oil tankers in the Gulf of Oman is not acceptable, and we need to investigate it. Second of all,
you don't accept what the Secretary, let me just ask, you don't accept the declaration from the Secretary of State?
No, I don't. I mean, there needs to be an objective investigation. As you know, the Japanese in fact, the owner of the tanker that was attacked disagrees with Trump. But here's the main point that I want to make. If you look at the recent history of this country, I think we understand that the two worst foreign policy disasters were based on lies that came from the White House. You remember the so-called Gulf of Tonkin incident that led us to increase military involvement in Vietnam. And man, I could speak, that was my generation. 59,000 brave young men never came home from that war, and tens of thousands of more died, committed suicide, got into drugs when they came home. That was based on a lie. And then you look more recently at the war in Iraq, which I vigorously opposed because I did not believe Cheney, and I did not believe John Bolton, and I did not believe the Bush administration. Again, based on a lie that Saddam Hussein in Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. Let me just say this. I will do everything that I personally can as a United States Senator to stop the United States attacking Iran. If we go into a war with Iran, this will be an asymmetrical war which will go on and on and on. There will be never-ending wars in the Middle East. It'll make the war in Iraq look like a cakewalk. So we have got to do everything we can to bring the antagonist, Saudi Arabia, which is a brutal dictatorship, together with Iran. Bring them together, use the power of the United States to work out a diplomatic solution, not a military solution.
You're going to be on a debate stage next week, facing off for the first time with Joe Biden. What's your strategy going against the front runner?
Well, you promised not to tell Joe.
Promise not to tell.
All right. If that's the case, look, Joe and I are friends, and I've known him for many years, and I thought he was a very good vice president. But Joe and I have a different outlook on the world. We have a different voting record. Joe voted for the war in Iraq. I voted against the war in Iraq. Joe voted for a lot of what I consider to be disastrous trade agreements, NAFTA, PNTR with China, cost us millions of good-paying jobs. I helped lead the opposition against those trade agreements. Joe voted for the deregulation of Wall Street. I strongly oppose that. And here's what I believe in terms of 2020. Joe wants to beat Donald Trump, and I want to beat Donald Trump, and every Democratic candidate understands how important it is that we defeat Donald Trump. I happen to believe that the only way we defeat Trump is through a large voter turnout, that you create excitement, that you get young people and working people involved in the political process. And the only way I know how you do that is you talk about the real issues that impact ordinary people's lives. Healthcare is a human right. We need Medicare for all. We have got to raise that minimum wage to $15 an hour. We have got to make public colleges and universities tuition-free and substantially reduce student debt. You want to get young people involved? Their generation is hurting. They're overly in debt, incredibly in debt. You got to talk about climate change in a bold way, because the scientists tell us we got all of 12 years to transform our energy system. So my view is we win when we bring out large numbers of people, when we tell the truth to Trump supporters about his lies, when we fight for criminal justice reform, fight for immigration reform, create excitement at the grassroots level. That's how we win. And I think those are the issues that we're talking about. And I think, as you know, many of the polls, I think the last 5 polls that were out there had me beating Trump by at least 9 points, sometimes double digits. We can beat Trump if we are prepared to talk about the real issues impact working people and young people and get them involved in the political process.
Well, Senator, one of the candidates who is talking about issues more than anyone, arguably, is Elizabeth Warren, your colleague, also against Wall Street, against big business, many of your issues, yet she's moving up in many of these polls, and you've been losing some altitude. So, Elizabeth Warren, does she have the formula rather than you?
Well, I'm
perhaps?
not going to. Well, you have to ask Elizabeth Warren. Elizabeth is a long-time
Why do you think
friend of
she's
mine.
being so successful right now?
Well, first of all, you know, some of the polls have me doing a lot better than Elizabeth Warren. Polls have you, depending on the polls. But one poll that I would stress, one series of polls, as I said, is the last 5 polls have us running far better than anybody else except Biden, by the way. And one poll we're running better than Biden against Donald Trump. And I think if the American people are looking at a candidate who can defeat Trump, I hope they will give serious consideration to our candidacy.
Senator Bernie Sanders, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much. See you in Miami.
Okay, take care.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.